On this, let's now speak to Nkanyiso Ngqulunga, who's a lawyer who specializes in competition law, consumer protection, as well as international trade law. Nkanyiso, it's great to have you with us. So talk to us in layman terms. What does this actually mean for South Africa specifically, who were at the higher end of the spectrum of those tariffs, reciprocal tariffs by Trump? A very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to the viewers at home. So for South Africa, then we must remember that there are categories of these tariffs. So the first tariff was the liberation tariff that imposed 33% on South African exports. And then there was also a separate ban, Donald Trump relying upon a very separate expansion of tariffs, of which were things like steel, lumber, and car components fall under a very different category of tariffs that were imposed by Trump. Trump had relied upon to the Section of 122 Trade Act of 1977. So even though there's a decision that is a victory for other countries, that also there's still uncertainty because there's industry-specific tariffs that did not fall under the case of the Supreme Court, of which some of those tariffs still apply very much to the South African products that we send to the United States and South Africa, like car components, copper, lumber, and all of those types of products are in fact still affected and hamstrung by the tariffs that are currently in existence in a separate piece of legislation in the United States.
Mm-hmm. I'd like you to unpack that, Nkanyiso, because we want to know, I'm sure you've studied the judgment from yesterday. It's still pretty early, so we want to understand what are some of the aforementioned recommendations there. Does it speak to anything about repayments? Because I suppose that's the next question that everybody wants to know. How is that going to happen?
Yeah, so the court has decided to leave the question of refunds. In fact, the court did not get to answer that question of refunds, and also even the dissenting opinion of the court penned down by Justice Brett Kavanaugh. I think that's one question I think he asked his colleagues in the majority as to then how do we deal with the issue of refunds. But as we know that it's happened in the past in the US in 1999, where similar circumstances arise from the Supreme Court decision where the government has to process refunds. So refunds will in fact be processed because the current importers in the US have incurred quite a number of costs because of the liberation tariffs. So, and to the value of estimated of about $200 billion now will have to be refunded. And according to Mr. Besant, the Treasurer Secretary, he has also said that they do have money available to process those refunds as the US government. But how would this work is that the government would not take the decision to just automatically refund everyone. So meaning that companies and corporations that are involved as importers in the American market will have to either prove or demonstrate that each and every one of them how much they are owed in order to process that particular refund. And also, furthermore, there is also aspects of Congress in the event that the US seeks more funding into funding those refunds. The Congress will have to pass a piece of legislation in order to be able to then process those refunds, because as we know that the budget making process in the US is done by Congress.
Mm-hmm. Then Nkanyiso, maybe talk to us about the overall global trade impact, right? Because we know that specifically in the case of South Africa, we were forced to seek rediversification and also seek new trade partners as an alternative, something that has been encouraged long ago. So talk to us about the overall impact in terms of geopolitical trade because of, firstly, the decision by Trump to impose these reciprocal tariffs, and also long-term, what is going to happen after this announcement to strike down on, of course, the imposition of these tariffs by the Supreme Court in the United States?
So it's going to be a very confusing time for most countries around the world, because we know that Trump used the Liberation Day tariffs to get to individual countries to come before him and negotiate certain deals based on his terms and based on his demands. And that has also created a lot of confusion and uncertainty with many countries, including US allies. So we're in a situation where, although the decision has been overturned by the Supreme Court, because the president exerted his power, but the president can still rely on a separate piece of legislation in the Trade Act to basically impose a further 10% tariff for 150 days for each country. So that's where the uncertainty is at the present moment, because in as much as the tariffs have been overturned by the court, but there's still going to be a 10% tariff that has been imposed across the countries globally. So this creates uncertainty because countries have to plan. There's a planning that goes into policy planning around the issue of tariffs, because tariffs are a form of tax that you have to pay. And also oftentimes it gets passed on to consumers. So it is creating that uncertainty as to where and for how long would that situation be. And I must also note that the new 10% tariff that has been imposed by the president, relying on the separate legislation, would only apply on the future imports, not the previous 33%, just like in the case of South Africa. So the new 10% that will kick in will then apply on the future imports that we going into the United States.
We understand some news, some positive news, Nkanyiso, is that, of course, since the announcement of the judgment by the Supreme Court yesterday, the rand has somewhat strengthened. But talk to us about business, South African business in particular, that had already suffered under the, of course, the reciprocal tariffs. When do they then start to feel the impact of the actual ruling? When do they get their gains back, so to speak?
Well, I think we have to look into what really is South African business selling into the United States. So we're looking into agricultural products. We're looking into car manufacturing components. We're looking into copper and all of those things that continue to be under immense pressure globally. And I think that this is some of the impact that has been seen, particularly in the automobile industries, like in Roslyn with BMW and with Ford in Silverton, where they find themselves having to lay off over 1,000 workers because of the drop in global volumes. And the drop has been caused largely by the tariffs and has also been dropped by the US restriction and increase on tariffs on the car components coming from South Africa, making the American market even more expensive and difficult to deal with by South African businesses. So there is still a wall, even though that I think there might be a bit of an ease for the agricultural products by virtue of AGOA, because the Supreme Court decision does in fact provide that form of relief for some of the South African exports. But some of the South African exports still fall under the category of other tariffs that were then announced by US president, because the president in the US can in fact decide when he believes that there is an unfair trade that is unfolding to impose separate tariffs, but not relying on the legislation that has been set aside by the Supreme Court. So then the South African businesses still find themselves in a very difficult position, unless, of course, if they could be even further easing on the tariffs, particularly for those industries. And I think those are the industries mostly export to South Africa, to the American market, of which is automobile industry, our copper, and other mineral resources.
And still a lot of uncertainty around AGOA there, Nkanyiso, because we understand it's only until, I suppose it's that 1 year period where we understand there's still going to be a reconsideration. So businesses, particularly in the agricultural sector, are just going to have to sit tight. Nkanyiso, thank you so much for schooling us and giving us that much needed clarity. Nkanyiso Ngqulunga is a lawyer who specializes in competition law, consumer protection, as well as international trade law.